Okay, I don't think that there's another video on YouTube about this subject. I would have come across it. I love to discuss like really important stuff that nobody else on the YouTube photography channels that are flapping their lips talk about. Some of the stuff that is really accumulative that is helpful is like some of the nitpicky stuff that like, wow, that's helpful, that's helpful. You get enough of those little things, they add up. Sometimes people don't really address significant things. Let's talk about, and I love to talk about lighting, speed lights, studio strobes. The one thing that you don't realize, and none of these other photography channels have talked about, someone's going to like, shut up, get to the point. Okay, I'm getting there, right? Okay, I know someone's thinking that right now. Someone's going to type it in the comments too. Speed lights and like a crappy zoom. Let's just take not necessarily a low resolution zoom lens. We're not talking about resolution here. We're talking about rendering. You know, a lens that doesn't really render that well. Kind of like a moderately decent or halfway decent, semi-crappy, let's just say a crappy zoom lens, right? It's like, well, it's not bad, you know, you can make an 8x10 out of it and, you know, look good enough. Why is it that a lens like that, and this is where battles occur, and people don't understand this. People don't understand how sensors work, and really, ultimately, they don't understand exposure. They think they know the exposure triangle, and they don't know the exposure triangle. And this is why a crappy zoom lens, given lighting, not this sort of lighting, continuous lighting, but bam, studio strobe, speed light, can render exquisitely. And it's extremely simple because your sensor craves saturation. Everything is gain and time and SNR. SNR is signal to noise ratio. Okay, let's say we have a really awesome prime lens at 50 millimeter and a crappy zoom lens which covers 50 millimeters. They're both shooting 50 millimeters. Okay, let's say we're shooting both of them at f/5.6. Obviously, the really awesome 50 millimeter is going to render really well. We're talking about normal lighting. And then the crappy zoom lens is going to render crappily, right? Is that a word, crappily? No. What's the difference between those two? How could you actually make that crappy? And this is where people fight. They're like, well, I've got that lens. I don't know why you're complaining about that crappy zoom lens. Because I have it, and here's a shot, and I'll go, yeah, you're using, which is good, you're using a speed light in that shot. It's like, well, so? That is really important. This is kind of like adding crutches to a crippled person, or even more than that, actually sticking him in like a highly motorized wheelchair, like a person that can't walk when it comes to a crappy zoom lens. And the reason for that is understanding exposure and understanding what the hell a speed light does or a studio strobe does. People don't realize, like, well, everything's light. No, there's a huge difference between ambient lighting and flash photography, whether that's speed light or studio strobe, and how that can greatly improve the rendering capabilities of a crappy or moderately crappy zoom lens, or, you know, even a crappy prime lens. The way it works is simply, since you have time, exposure, and SNR, or gain and time, gain, of course, being aperture, time, of course, being shutter speed, SNR is signal to noise ratio. Given a crappy zoom lens which doesn't really render that well, it's got too much glass, it just renders a muddy image. Someone will say, well, I have that lens, I don't know why you're complaining about that crappy zoom lens, because look, here it is. It's like, yeah, you're using a studio strobe. The reason why it renders so well is people don't understand that to any time, unless you're shooting in total darkness and your only lighting is a studio strobe or a speed light, any sort of xenon flash bulb burst, speed light or studio strobe, is a second exposure on top of your current exposure. Say you're shooting at 1/500th of a second. The typical speed light output is, say, 1/4 power. Average is about 1/13,000, let's just say 1/10,000th of a second. Your sensor is receiving, while it is open, say, for 1/250th of a second. Within a very, very minuscule brief sliver of that 1/250th of a second, it is receiving an enormous amount of signal to noise ratio gain, i.e. the saturation of the light bounced off of that subject matter, unless you're doing also background illumination as well in a studio setting, off your subject matter, and dropping that light with incredible gain. You know, kind of like like getting 5 bars on your cell phone antenna. You're getting incredible saturation, and this is how. And I'm surprised no one's ever talked about this before on any of these photography channels. How you can actually get a crappy or decent, zoom lens or a crappy prime lens to render, you know, shockingly pleasingly. So you got some crappy zoom lens that's got 23 elements in it. Well, you can overcome that impediment where it renders flat, muddy images by adding a speed light and a studio strobe. Obviously, there's not too many situations, well, there's some, too many situations where you're talking about using a 70 to 200 with a speed light, you know, shooting, unless you actually have the speed light up there near the subject where you're actually zoomed in at someone at 200 millimeters on your 70 to 200, and you know your speed light really isn't reaching that far. It's barely touching your subject with sufficient illumination. But the principle is everything is about gain, SNR specifically, not gain as far as the aperture, but the gain at the sensor. You have to differentiate out gain at the sensor versus gain at the aperture. So we have aperture and shutter speed, or gain and time. All of that being consistent between normal photography, you know, where you're using ambient illumination. This is why it is so incredibly important, and people are afraid, which is very stupid, afraid of using speed lights. Like, well, it's tough enough to learn my camera, and I got to learn how to use a speed light too. On top of that, it's just too much. People aren't really afraid of speed lights, but they are. It's like, you know, the 800-pound gorilla in the room nobody wants to talk about. But this really does improve your image rendering, especially if you're using crappy glass. And the reason for that, it is dropping extremely high levels of SNR, signal to noise ratio, on your sensor. Some crappy zoom lens with 23, you know, 16, whatever, 23 elements in it. You know, you're able to overcome that impediment because glass is not only a insulator, it's also an electrical capacitor. And if you think light is anything other than something that is an electrical circuit, then you're not too bright. But most people don't know stuff like that anyway. By dropping that serious saturation in 1/10,000th of a second, which is typical speed light and studio strobe output, you're able to overcome the impediment of crappy glass. And herein is where people will argue with you, like I said before. People are like, I got that crappy zoom lens. I don't know what's wrong with it. Here's some images. It's like, yeah, you're using a speed light. Or a studio strobe. Usually it's a speed light. Most people don't have a studio strobe. They should have. Depends on, you know, amateur photographers don't need a studio strobe. And that's the difference. It's like, well, I don't see the difference. You know, you said it's a crappy lens, but now you say it's great. It's like, no, it's still a crappy lens. But you're able to overcome that impediment by dropping high levels of signal-to-noise ratio on your sensor. This is actually an invaluable, important, maybe boring to you topic of photography, but I noticed, you know, in driving, you know, coming back, I didn't drive, I flew back. Flying back from Florida, it's like, you know, nobody's made a video about this incredibly important topic. Maybe I should make a video on that topic. And here it is. If you like this video, click the link below. We always make a small donation because I don't live off of affiliate links, and I'm not a shill like everybody else who's pimping and shilling for like New York retailers or some camera company. I don't get any money that way, and I'm killing myself making not only videos, but the real killer is I didn't even leave the house today till 1 p.m. I did so many tech support calls and emails. It just wore me the hell out. Look in my eye and tell me if I'm lying. Yeah, it wore me the hell out. Thank you so much for watching. Catch you later. Peace, love, hasta luego, all that crap. Bye.